The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Uriya Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
So basically the question you're asking is, why do Muslims bomb themselves in Europe? Or why do some Muslims do that? And that is not a very easy one to answer, but first let's say what is not the reason, which is often where Europeans look. There's a misconception in Europe, a misperception, that this is mainly a problem of integration. That these are people who are either not welcomed by society, or at least have the subjective sense that they're not welcome, could not find good jobs, could not find good wives, felt that they are biased against, and so forth. Now, for some of them, this is true. But the fact is, when you read the biographical background of people who were either involved in such act or were indicted for being, for aspiring to be involved in such acts, when you read their biographies, some of them were actually doing quite well. We don't have one socioeconomic biographical background for terrorists. Some have higher education, some don't, some are employed, some are unemployed, some are married, some are single, some are of Arab descent, some are of Turkish extraction. We don't have one single ideal type of the European terrorist. And the one thing they do have in common is not their biographies or a common background of not doing well, but ideology. The one thing that unites all these people is the idea that as Muslims in Europe, their task, their religious duty is to inflict as much pain, damage, and destruction on European targets. That is, to act from within against European targets. Now, this seems to be something that has always been with us and is associated with Al-Qaeda originally, but it's actually quite a new phenomenon. It's only with the 9/11 attacks that the idea of the Muslim migrant as someone whose religious duty is to inflict damage on the West from within developed, evolved. And something we need to have in mind is that Al-Qaeda did not start off as something like this. Al-Qaeda in the 90s centered mostly, almost entirely, on bringing down the Saudi regime. Al-Qaeda started as an organization centered on bringing down or forcing a Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. What was the moment in history that bin Laden went global, that jihad went global? That moment was when he found out that he's actually not able to bring down the Saudi regime. So in a sense, targeting European targets is something that signifies the failure of jihadism, not its success. And with ISIS, to an extent, it is quite similar. ISIS is now in a position where it finds it very difficult to further expand in Syria and in Iraq. Then it goes global. Going global is not a sign for strength for those organizations. It usually is a sign of failure within their own states and countries. Sharia in Muslim Minorities is a book about the evolution, the development of religious laws pertaining to situations which are unique for Muslim minorities. For example, is it permissible for a Muslim living in Europe to obtain a citizenship of a European state, if that means being loyal to a European state? Is it permissible for a Muslim to serve in a Western military force, especially if that military force is fighting, let's say, ISIS? Is it permissible for a Muslim to work in McDonald's, considering that in McDonald's you sell pork? Is it permissible for a football player who is Muslim to not play or actually to break fasting on Ramadan if that is what the management requires of him. So this is a field with hundreds of fascinating questions which are very much relevant to the lives of ordinary Muslims, or at least those of them who wish to lead their lives in accordance to Sharia. There are millions of people to whom these questions are very much relevant, and there are European school administrators, politicians, lawyers who really need to acquaint themselves with the realities of life in Europe, and I think perhaps by reading this book they can learn more about Europe's largest religious minority. Well, what this book does, and the English version, by the way, is called Islamism in the West, and it's a book about Islamist ideology and how it understands the West, how it has understood the West from late 19th century to the present. There is a trend, that there is almost a school in Islamist thought, not in Islamic thought, but in Islamist thought, that has predicted the ultimate demise, decline, collapse of Western civilization already since the 19th century. But this school really grew stronger in the latter decades of the 20th century and is very strong today. And the idea of this school is quite simple. The West seems very strong. It is as if it is very strong, but in reality it is very weak. And the reason it is weak is that it is morally corrupt. The family is disintegrated. Values no longer exist, and most importantly, there is no God in life. There is no faith. And therefore, the West is bound to fall, to collapse. From mainstream Islamist point of view, there is no need for violence. There is no need for violence to bring the West down. From mainstream Islamist point of view, there is a prophetic tradition. The Prophet said, the Prophet was asked, which of the cities will fall first, Constantinople or Rome? And he answered Constantinople, which indeed happened in 1453 when it became Istanbul. And one of the most prominent Islamist theorists of our time said the fact that half the prophecy already materialized, already came to be true, is indication that the second half of the prophecy will also come to be true. Rome will also fall and become Muslim. But he added, I am certain this will happen with the tongue, not with the sword. There will not be need for violence because the Italians and the Westerners themselves understand that Islam is the only solution for their troubles. The radicals don't see it that way. They believe something active needs to be done, violence must be applied to sort of prompt the inevitable demise of the West. And did you notice how they justified attacking Paris? So one justification was that France is involved in attacking ISIS, which makes sense. Now we have two states and they are at war. But the other was that Paris is the city of promiscuity. And Paris has been the base of an idea that troubled the Arab mind since the late 19th century, secularism. The possibility, the option of living without God, of living without the book, without the revelation, and the very terrifying idea that it is societies that are secular, that are doubt-based, that do better than societies which are religious. This idea which terrifies Muslim scholars. Paris was chosen for a reason. It's not just that Paris is an easy target, and it's not the first time, but it's not just that Paris is an easy target, and not just that Paris, France is involved in war with ISIS, and French jets attack ISIS targets. It's also that Paris is the symbol of everything in the West which those Islamists really hate. You know, the day it happened, I saw in the New York Times and BBC, they drew a distinction between the Charlie Hebdo incident and this. They said in January this year, there was an attack on a newspaper that insulted the Prophet, or so-called insulted the Prophet, and on a Jewish kosher restaurant or something of that kind. Now that makes sense. You attack a newspaper because it insulted the Prophet, and you attack Jews, which always makes sense. But they said, in both those distinguished media, they said the attacks in Paris last week, they were random. They were not random. A football pitch was attacked, a football stadium was attacked, a Cambodian restaurant that I guess serves pork was attacked, and a heavy metal band was attacked. Everything that symbolizes what Islamists hate about the West was attacked. Note, a cathedral was not attacked. A synagogue was not attacked. Not a religious symbol was attacked. The symbol of secularism were attacked. They could have attacked any cathedral. Someone that I spoke with about this today said, but there is no one at the cathedrals in France, so there was no. That is not entirely true. There are people there. If you follow the logic of suicide bombs in Israel, of suicide bombers in Israel, note that usually it was cafes, pubs that were attacks. And it was again symbol of secularism. That this is what Islamists, this is what this kind of Islamists are after. We need to emphasize, we always have to keep in mind that 99% of Muslims and 99% of Muslim communities are very much against these atrocities and in a real way. And even extremists, and even people who are defined as radicals or extremists, for example, Salafis, are active, perhaps active more than anyone else, against such acts. And I say that as someone who visits the mosques. There is prolific literature there that explains to people why doing such things is betrayal of Islam. Not betrayal of the secular state, betrayal of Islam. So these acts in no way characterize Muslim communities in Europe. I say that it's important to draw this distinction for a number of reasons, but one of them is that if you turn all Muslims to potential terrorists, then you create a certain cycle of hatred, which in itself creates a premise for recruits of new terrorists. So this is a very important distinction. You know, we have to have in mind something, that we are talking today. It is Monday after the attack. There are millions of Muslim kids who went to school today, and their schoolmates looked at them differently. And this is a very bad feeling for those kids. It's a very bad sentiment. So we have to also have, as much as the moment is difficult, we have to have those kids in mind. It's natural, but it's very painful. And especially if the child comes from a family that in a very authentic sense feels these acts are un-Islamic. You know, political correctness and honesty and looking at things as they are should not prevent us from acknowledging the fact that Europe faces a very big problem, and it needs to deal with this problem very seriously. There are a lot of ideas about what needs to be done, but I'd like to point to two things which I think are most crucial and also most doable, not theories, things that can be done. So one thing is, it is almost crazy that the main producers of hate speech, of the idea that you as a non-Muslim are a lesser person in the West, and the main sponsors of radicalization in the West, and perhaps also of ISIS itself, the main generators of instability in the West are Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Why? Mainly because they can, and they don't pay any price. Instability in the Middle East, whether it's ISIS or Hamas, and radical views in certain radical views, not all radical views, but certain radical views in European mosques are sponsored, financed directly and indirectly by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Why is this so crazy? Because these are two states that exist only because the United States safeguards their existence. If there is no United States tomorrow, there is no Qatar and no Saudi Arabia. If the United States declares tomorrow that it will not do anything, if Iran, for example, invades Qatar, then after 4 hours there is no Qatar, and after 24 there is no Saudi Arabia. And yet, this goes on. Money doesn't buy you security. It's good, strong military forces that buy you that, and they don't have that force. It's the United States that defends them. So I think one thing that has to be done, if the West is logical at all, is to simply put forward an ultimatum to Saudi Arabia and to Qatar. You must cease finance, sponsor, and promote radicalization anywhere, whether it's Gaza, Syria, or Paris. This must come as an ultimatum. They will understand. They will understand, especially Qatar, that is really eager to host the World Cup. The formula should be very simple. If there is no security to play football in Paris, there will be none in Doha. This, by the way, is a wonderful example of the hypocrisy of those states, of Qatar, Dubai. Without getting into too much detail, I have written quite a lot on football and Islam. Without getting into too much details, there is no way, from the point of view of religious law, for anyone to be devout and to sponsor football culture as it is practiced in the West today. Do you know why Qatar, and it's actually Qatar, sponsors Barcelona? It's for the exact same reason that it sponsors Hamas, which is also the exact same reason why the elephant sits on a mouse, because it can. Because it can. And they have the money, and the world is their playground. So you play war in Gaza, and you play football in Barcelona. It's a very nasty comparison, because it says something about the nature of the war in Gaza, but it also says something about the nature of football today. Qatar not only plays a tremendous role in bringing instability to the Middle East, it also played a tremendous role in the corruption of European football. And it's, again, in my view, it is madness not only to hold the World Cup in 50 degrees Celsius in a country that has no football tradition. It is also ridiculous. It also doesn't make sense to offer this gesture, to allow this to happen in a state that contributes so much to Middle Eastern and European stability. The other thing that must be done, and here actually Israel is the example to follow, security must be tightened. Security must be tightened. It is almost ridiculous how easy it is to infiltrate strategic targets in Europe today. I'll tell you two very short stories. I sat a few weeks ago with several German security officials, and I asked them, why is it so easy to enter a main train station in Europe today? Technically, there is nothing to stop you from entering, for 6 young people to enter a main train station with guns and explosives. There is no one to check, no one to inspect. Yet, if you embark on a plane, it's a very long process. Why is that? I mean, the potential damage of taking on a train, you still have to be logical. I mean, if the train is so vulnerable, you must come up with some idea what is the distinction between it and an airport. And one of them said, of course you're right. It doesn't make sense. The potential strategic damage of taking on a train is just the same as a plane. But in Europe today, we can do that. People would consider it a violation of their human rights, of their civil rights, if they are asked to open the bags. Well, they should be asked to open the bags. The only reason why this ended on Friday with around 200 casualties instead of thousands is that there was one guard at the entrance of the football stadium. That makes all the difference. So it has to be tightened. I tell you another story. I was Thursday in the church or the monastery in Milano where they have the Last Supper, a great piece of art of Christian and Western civilization. There is nothing to stop anyone from entering that place with whatever one needs to destroy it and take everyone who's there hostage. This doesn't make any sense. But now they must think about it, and they must make a difference. And I think Israel is actually an example that, yes, the cost is very high. You know, we have around 100,000 people of a population of 8 million whose job is to inspect people entering universities and theaters and cinemas and malls. Yet society survives. Let's set the record straight. Islam did not infiltrate Europe. Europeans invited millions of Muslims to their continent from the late 50s on, because they did not want to be the ones who wash the dishes in restaurants. That is the entire story. There is no infiltration here. Now there are waves of refugees, but that's a totally different story. Muslims came to Europe in organized fashion. When they came, no one thought of them as Muslims, by the way. Until the late 80s. What you'd see in the discourse is the North Africans of France, the Turks of Germany, the Pakistanis of England. No one spoke of Muslims. They later became the Muslims of Europe. And Europe learned, well, for a number of reasons, but the first and foremost is that Europe learned an important lesson. You know, there is a famous saying, we invited workers, we invited labor, they sent us human beings. It is always the same story. You invite people because you don't want to wash the dishes, but then you discover that these people have families, they have feelings, they have ambitions, and yes, they also have religion. In this case, the religion is Islam. And this is something that Europe discovered at a certain point. Yes, these people have political ambitions, religious ambitions, and so forth. Now, why they became Muslim has to some extent do with the rise of religious sentiments among the Muslim population itself. That is, in very general terms, the Muslims of the continent are today more Muslim than they were when they came. There is much more Islam in the continent, by the way, not necessarily many more Muslims, but there is much more Islam. There are many, many more mosques. You know, in France in the 70s, there were several dozen mosques. Today, there are more than 2,500. One reason is that a lot of money was invested, mainly by Gulf states, mainly by Saudi Arabia, on creating a presence for Islam. That is, there came a point where Islamic religious scholars and Islamic leaders understood that the waves of migrants are there to stay. They're not going to go anywhere. There's going to be a second generation and a third generation. And then came a question which is actually a Shari question. It's a question of religious law and theology. Is this permissible? Is this halal? Can we allow this, that Muslims stay in Europe? And let us assume that those religious scholars, those jurists, had said, you must go back. You must come back. Return to Morocco, return to Turkey. Would that happen? Would millions of migrants go back? Go back to what? To where? Of course it would not have happened. So they did something which is quite clever. They said, okay, we cannot force these people back. We cannot even encourage them to go back. It's not going to work. Let's do something else. Let's turn them, let's conceptualize them, not as lesser Muslims, not as Muslims who failed Islam, who betrayed Islam. Let's conceptualize them as a vanguard, as missionaries, as the pioneers of Islam. And this theology, which conceptualized Muslims as missionaries, Muslim migrants, gave justification to dedicate billions of dollars for the creation, for the establishment of community centers, mosques, delegations of exchange students and so forth. And perhaps first and foremost, of sending imams to the West, to teach in the West, to lecture in the West. Now, make no mistake, the vast majority of Muslims in Europe do not identify with this concept and probably have no idea that it exists. But it did give rise, because of the theological justification it created, it did give rise to numerous Islamic initiatives that created homes for people who wish to be Muslim. You know, because to build a mosque, if it's a grand mosque, if it's a beautiful mosque, with all the facilities, is something that costs a lot of money. and someone had to finance those things. To send young people to Saudi Arabia or to Egypt to study Arabic, to study law, to sort of fortify their religious sentiments is something that costs a lot of money. In France there were two stages. First there was a law prohibiting the introduction of religious symbols in public schools, which means, by the way, that not only the hijab is banned, but also the kippah, or certain kippahs, and crosses. So the law is universal. Then there was a law much later which prohibited women from wearing the niqab, the full face veil, in the public sphere. These are two different laws. What happened in Switzerland was a law banning the establishment, the building of mosques with minarets. These are all laws that testify to a sentiment in Europe of to the very least, hesitation of whether multiculturalism is something that can work. And these laws are perceived by Muslims as derogatory and as prejudice. I mean, the police can go anywhere. The police can go to any neighborhood. Maybe there is this softness in some European security forces that they prefer not to go. That is wrong. There should be, and there can be, police presence in any neighborhood in Europe. I have to tell you, as someone who has visited some of the more harsh neighborhoods, some of the more scary, or sort of so-called scary mosques, that is not really, that is not the issue. The issue is that there is a certain percentage, certain fraction of people who are captivated not just by or with an ideology of Islamic supremacy, of Islam as the solution for the problems of Europe, but also come to believe that violence is the way to promote that goal. And Europe must be much, much more tough in how it deals with these people. I mean, what is really troubling is that time and again we see that people involved in those crimes, involved in terrorism, were already arrested at some point or investigated. But European security forces and judiciaries did not have the legal authority to act against these people with measures that accord with the magnitude of the threat. Laws must be universal in democracies. Laws must be universal. And Europe must now apply laws that are universal against terrorism. Now, if hypothetically there is Jewish terrorism, the same laws should be applied. And we only hear and we only feel the pain about things that actually happened. What the public does not know is how many dozens of incidents were prevented, how many dozens of terror cells were exposed before they managed to do exactly the thing that the terrorists did on Friday. I think what you're concerned with is what are the odds that some of these people are actually terrorists. Well, very great. It would not make sense if ISIS targeted Europe, that it did not send a substantial number of fifth column Muslims as part of that wave, and it's not likely that Europe has the ability, that its security, its intelligence agencies have the ability to screen and to always distinguish between the refugee and the so-called refugee who is actually sent as a terrorist and awaits the moment. This is a very, very difficult crisis in this sense. Hungary, for example, was very clear. We are a Christian state and we don't want Muslims. And I think there are any number of reasons that call for some caution in terms of any society absorbing a large number of migrants who come from a different culture and from a different country. I think what Europe really realizes now is that globalization is not just about open borders and one currency, one single currency, and peace and happiness for everyone. Globalization also means that if hundreds of thousands of people die in Syria in war, at some point this will reach Europe. And you know, this is also something we need to remember. The world cries now about the death of hundreds of people in France. But in Syria, in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people died. What happened in Paris on Friday, on the terrible Friday, is the reality of Iraq every day. That's exactly the meaning of globalization. It is not far. It's the same internet that does all those good things, that makes it possible for someone to recruit a young person to arrive in Syria and then to send that someone back. It's the same very fast transportation that makes travels today and tourism so nice and easy, that make terrorism much easier than it was before. Globalization comes at a price. There was legal migration and there's migration that's not legal. I have to say it was not as easy 10 years ago to just enter Europe. You know. Schengen is a nice word, but if you try to take a train from, let's say, one of the Balkan countries to Germany, there would be a policeman at the train who would ask for your passport. I say that from experience. Someone asks to see your passport. So there were never really open borders. That's a myth. But definitely the borders are far more open than they were 30 years ago, and yes, some people did take advantage of that. I think Europeans should recognize also at the moment that the open borders idea is a means, it's not an end. The goal of the European Union was to create a community of Europeans living in peace and helping one another in reaching as much prosperity as possible. If open borders, if this wonderful moment that you can just cross from the Netherlands to Belgium without a passport, if it becomes a problem, if it becomes something that impedes on liberty itself, then it should be halted for a while. There's no harm is going to be done by the fact that the line for Europe, as an Israeli, you know this, there is the line for the people with European passport and the others. It's not going to be such a terrible moment when those lines, at least for a while, if they're integrated. I think a change already occurred when Angela Merkel and David Cameron almost openly relinquished the multicultural concept, multicultural politics, and said that multiculturalism failed. I think generally over the past years there is far more suspicion and caution in Europe with regards to the integration of Muslim migrants and the existence of prominent Muslim presence in the continent. To say the truth, I'm not sure that in 2 weeks, the events that happened, as you call them, the November 14th, that they will be remembered as some people think. I think there was an expectation that something will happen after the Charlie Hebdo incident, the Charlie Hebdo attack. That was not the case. I thought it would make sense for France, for example, to declare war on ISIS. France has the means, has the energy, and definitely has now the grounds, the motivation, but also the grounds, the grounds in terms of international law, to declare war on ISIS. And what I read this morning in the newspaper is the French defense secretary saying actually that no ground invasion is planned. In fact, he said the exact opposite. ISIS, you have nothing to fear. We are not going to declare war on you. If that is the sentiment 3 days after the attacks, what's going to be left of it in 2 weeks, 3 weeks? If there is something troubling in all of this, is seeing how, perhaps with the exception of England, and even England under a conservative government is not a good example. There is lack of energy to fight for anything. There is this sentiment, which we remember from history, of avoiding war almost at all costs. There is lack of energy, there is lack of will. There is still the hope that we will find a way to deal with them. We will integrate, we will make some compromise, that we will find a way. Or we will simply declare all of this to be very irrational and senseless, and therefore something that belongs more to the psychiatric department than to politics. That is not the case. This is war. It is war waged against certain values and against certain states. And in wars, one side or another ultimately wins. I'll tell you something about what happened on what you call November 14th. I don't know if you coined it or it's already in the media. These attacks were not the best ISIS can do. These attacks were in many ways ill-conceived and not well planned. ISIS and others have the ability to inflict much more damage and do it in a way which is much more painful. And the answer to your question has a lot to do with whether something of a greater magnitude will be done. I don't think we need here to give ideas, to say what is that something. But there are things which carry far greater implications. What happened on November 14th was again very painful, very traumatic, but it was not really strategic. This was not a case of something strategic being harmed, save for the sense of security people have, which I guarantee to you in 1 month from now will be resumed, because people have the wonderful capacity to forget things they don't want to remember. I will say one thing that I think also needs to happen, which takes us to a very different dimension. Put yourself just for one moment in the place of a young European Muslim today. Let's say a young European Muslim today hears the interview, the questions you asked me, the answers I get. There is a problem today in Europe that young Muslims don't really have role models to look up to. Young people need role models, and they need role models they can identify with. That is, young Muslims in Europe need Muslim role models. And there are only two types of role models for Muslim Europeans today. It's football players, as you mentioned, and Muslim terrorists. These are the two that make the headlines. It's really vital that the media, in a fair and honest way, provide these young people with role models that are Muslim and are positive role models and authentic. And such people exist, and such examples exist. I'll give you two very short. A month ago, an American Turk, who's a Muslim, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Now, what a wonderful example this is for young Muslims across the world, but especially in the West, that yes, you can be a Muslim and win Nobel Prizes. That's not just a Jewish thing. And for the past almost 20 years, over the course of the last 2 decades, Indonesia, which just happens to be the world's largest Muslim country, has gone through a wonderful process of democratization. At a time when several Christian countries, first and foremost Russia, retreated from the course of democracy, Indonesia sets a wonderful example. Now I ask you, how many articles have you read about the American Turk Muslim Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in comparison to the number of articles you read about Jihadi John? And how many articles or interviews have you read about Indonesia paired to the number of interviews and articles you read about ISIS? This is also reality, and I think showing reality with all its diversity is something the media should do, first for the sake of fair reporting, but also for the sake of those young Muslims who need role models. I think there were days in history, the days of Nazism, the days of communism, when there was a real threat to the existence of the West and its values, a military threat. Today we don't have two forces that are comparable in any way. ISIS does not really pose a threat to the existence of the West. The only thing that really does pose a threat to the existence of the West as a civilization, of the European Union, as a political body and a cultural body, is that something we already mentioned, this sense of, especially young people, that there isn't really anything that's worth fighting for. And in the end, even if your enemy is weak, and ISIS is a weak enemy, you must be willing and ready to fight it if you want to overcome.